What's up, guys? Dylan here, and today I'm going to talk about 7 key reasons why I think the price of Bitcoin is almost guaranteed to continue to go up. So, like, comment, share, subscribe below, and of course, let me know what you think about this in the comments below as well. So, I'm gonna first start off and say that I am not a financial advisor. I cannot predict the future. None of this is financial advice. Always do your own research. Yada. I'm just some guy on the internet. Educate yourself on this, and don't just take some price prediction. And this isn't a price prediction. This is me talking about I think key factors that if you look into these things and they prove to be true, that will almost guarantee that the price of Bitcoin today will be less than the price of Bitcoin in the future. And one more thing to say here is that there's been a saying in the Bitcoin community is that no one's ever lost money investing in Bitcoin over a 4-year time horizon. And that's been roughly true since the inception of Bitcoin. And will that be true going forward? We don't know until it happens. But the general purpose of that saying is kind of to position your mind and mindset and the way you think about Bitcoin as not just some like overnight get rich quick scheme, right? Not something where you're going to double your money overnight, but something that you look to invest in over a longer term period of time, which changes. And I've made videos on this, like about how you allocate your capital for investments. Like you have short term, you have long term, you have short and speculative, right? Depending on your risk profile, depending on what type of returns you want. I've made videos on that. And there's videos out there on that. So, but the thought of like with Bitcoin, only you've people haven't lost money over a 4-year time horizon, which it should get you thinking. It's like maybe if I'm just thinking about something to make a quick buck, maybe Bitcoin isn't the answer, right? It's possible, but if it's a 4-year time window, maybe you need to have a longer term time horizon. And I recommend that to everyone. Start longer term, and because it's just start there, and then do the research, educate yourself, and then you can make your adjustments as you see fit. With that said, let's get into these 7 reasons why I think the price of Bitcoin will continue to go up. So, number one is limited supply and halving events. If you don't know, one thing to know about Bitcoin is that there are 21 million Bitcoin. There'll only be 21 million Bitcoin, and each Bitcoin is made up of 100 million Satoshis. So I think it's like 2.1 quadrillion total units for Bitcoin. And the number of units don't matter, right? What matters is that you can't increase that supply beyond that amount. When you increase the supply, that's inflating the supply. And we've seen that with fiat currencies is when the increase of the supply of dollars is increased. If you're holding the dollars and then the supply increases, you relatively hold a lower percentage of the entire supply, which dilutes your purchasing power in general, right? It can get nuanced and complicated, but in general, that's how that works. With Bitcoin, if you own one Bitcoin, you will forever own 1/21 millionth of the network. There is no way possible for you to own less should the rules of Bitcoin that we have today hold into the future, should that supply cap hold. The cool thing about that is if you have a limited supply, but demand for that goes up, what happens? Generally, the price will go up as well because there's less of that supply, or it becomes more valuable because more people want it, which means that you have more people, more liquidity in that market, or more people to interact with to give different prices. Okay. So this is just natural supply and demand, people. It's not that complicated, but when you think about it, that's pretty interesting. And one key fact I think to think about is that there are like 50 million millionaires in the world, and there are only 21 million Bitcoin in the world. Okay. So if Bitcoin takes off, I believe that it will, not every single millionaire will be able to hold one Bitcoin. Right now, you can get a Bitcoin around $25,000 at the time of this video. So now you have something that not even half of the millionaires of the world can get that. And this isn't even to mention, that's assuming that each person can go out and get one Bitcoin a day. But like Michael Saylor from MicroStrategy has, I don't know, like 100,000, like he's got 100,000 Bitcoin. He's got a ton of Bitcoin, right? Billions of dollars worth. So that's 120, 130, 140,000 millionaires that if they don't have Bitcoin, won't be able to have Bitcoin in the future. So it's even less. So that alone could be very interesting because what do people with money like? They like to buy scarce, desirable goods and whatever. Scarce, desirable art, scarce, desirable things, scarce, desirable land, right? They like to buy these things because they're scarce, so there's limited supply, and they're desirable to convey a status, which means that they'll hold their value. And people with lots of money, they have to put their lots of fiat money into these assets, into these things, because they know that the fiat money loses value. So they're always searching out for vehicles to park their money so that it doesn't erode over time or erodes more slowly than the value of the fiat dollar. So they have to put their money places. So knowing that and knowing that Bitcoin is a place that's really easy to park your money, and that over half of these millionaires in the future won't be able to put their money directly or as much money as they want directly into Bitcoin is a very promising and bullish sign. On top of this, we have halving events for Bitcoin. So these happen every 4 years. And what happens is basically the supply of Bitcoin, the distribution supply gets cut in half. Right now, we're at 6.25, and it'll be at 3.125 in the future. So if the supply of Bitcoin coming on the market gets cut in half and the demand continues to increase, what naturally happens? Price goes up, right? If demand outstrips the supply. And so that has proven to be correct over the life cycle of Bitcoin. Will it be correct in the future? I think it will be, but we can't know for certain. Which brings us to number 2, is increasing institutional adoption. This is something that's been talked a lot about in the Bitcoin circles. And what has happened, and we're seeing this, what has happened is what they call larger or big money, smart money has been considering Bitcoin. So this kind of started back in, I think it was 2020 with MicroStrategy, which became one of the first publicly traded companies to add Bitcoin to their balance sheet. And one thing that Michael Saylor talks about is these large organizations that have billions and sometimes trillions of dollars, and the market cap of Bitcoin right now is 500 billion. So they have these corporations have a lot of money. He's like, one of the problems is they have this money and they're always looking for places to put that money. They're always looking for, like I said, with the millionaires before, is because they know that just holding that money in cash, it erodes in value. Now there's times and places and strategies to do that, but generally they like to put their money somewhere where that it can maintain its value or grow in value. So as the business grows, and they can also get access to that money. The problem with these large organizations is it's very hard for them to invest billions of dollars because there's a lot of checks and balances that need to happen. So it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort in both just doing the paperwork, creating the strategy, but also convincing the board of directors, like the CEO, the shareholders, and everyone involved in that company. Okay, there's a lot of risk and there's a lot of nuance into getting that set up. With MicroStrategy paving the way in 2020, we've had more companies do the same. I know Tesla bought Bitcoin. I think Square has Bitcoin. There's a few other ones out there that publicly have that. The model has been created for other institutions to follow. They're not going to be the first one, so which it de-risks that space. So if more and more institutions start getting set up, getting the right compliance things in place, and so on and so forth, I'm not an expert on the compliance of massive organizations, but if they get the right protocols and procedures and processes and people in place to be able to buy Bitcoin, it creates these floodgates. And once those floodgates open, so once they start buying, they have lots of money to buy, which increases the demand even further than just general retail investors. We're talking about companies that can buy $1 billion in an instant. Right? That's what they want to be able to do. And with Bitcoin, that's something, and because it's been around, is becoming more and more of that asset that these companies now know about and they know how to buy it. And we're just waiting on the dam to break, basically. So when that happens, if this starts becoming a percentage of institutional investors' portfolios, 1%, 2%, 3%, 5%, right? That's a lot of money that will flow into the space. And of course, limited supply, more demand, price goes up. Which brings us to number 3, growing global acceptance. So Bitcoin is growing globally, right? It's been one of the fastest growing asset classes ever. And it's becoming, with videos like this, with creators like myself, with just big, conferences, with all this talk about Bitcoin, it's been around. And so what happens when something's been around and it's been talked about and people have heard about it, more and more people start utilizing it. More and more people start understanding it. And as they start utilizing it and understanding it, right, acceptance increases and fear about it or uncertainty starts to go down because it becomes more and more normalized. This is happening. We even saw in El Salvador, and this is a great example of them making Bitcoin legal tender. So they use that as a strategy to attract outside capital country to be a part of, they're reforming the country. I talked to someone from El Salvador, and the murder rate is way down. The president of El Salvador is a polarizing figure, but this individual gave a lot of praise to the president of El Salvador for what he's done. Like now, this individual feels like they can go back and visit and they don't have to feel unsafe or anything like that, which is amazing. And so that is an example of growing global acceptance. So that's just one example, but there's tons of other countries that can follow that model and implement. And when that happens, all that does is creates more money, more demand for Bitcoin. Okay, more people that can now utilize Bitcoin. Because one of the knocks people say is no one accepts it. No one wants to spend their Bitcoin. And it's like a chicken or egg scenario. People are like, well, when will people start spending that Bitcoin? And Bitcoin won't grow until people spend it, but people won't spend it if Bitcoin's going to grow. Like they're just waiting on each other. But with more and more of these economies, more and more of these companies, more and more of these businesses starting to accept Bitcoin, we'll see the adoption of actually using the Bitcoin, creating economies around Bitcoin increase as we go forward. Which brings us to number 4 is geopolitical and economic uncertainty. As I said before, with El Salvador, right, they were relying on the US dollar. Right? And a lot of these countries out there, they have seen their currencies collapse. They've seen especially with the things going on in the world, with BRICS forming, with the talk about the death of the dollar, without the war in Ukraine, with alliances between Russia and China, we're seeing a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. We're seeing a lot of maneuvering and positioning. And the last thing that countries want to do, the last thing that people want is to be holding assets that lose their value, that no longer work the same way they did before. And with that, when people start questioning what assets they're holding, what assets they're investing in, you can't go through that questioning process and that decision process without considering Bitcoin. Of course, you could, but it'd be naive to not consider it at all. And with Bitcoin, you don't need everyone to say, all right, we're going to start buying Bitcoin. You just need enough of a percentage of them to consider it. And once they consider it, enough of a percentage will start buying it. And this creates this snowball effect. So as you have this uncertainty, it causes people to question what assets they're holding, why they're holding those assets, and it causes people to make decisions to switch allocations or switch types of assets. And naturally, because of Bitcoin's growth and the education around it over the past 14 years, Bitcoin is now starting to be included and accepted in those conversations. So as more of those conversations happen, it's more likely that Bitcoin will become an asset or receive a larger allocation of capital from whoever, individuals, from countries, from nation states, whatever it is. It'll start to receive a larger allocation of capital. And of course, what does that do? Increases demand with a limited supply, generally means that price will go up. Which brings us to number 5, is now institutional grade infrastructure and regulations. So the key thing here is regulations. We're dealing with this right now with the SEC going after different crypto companies. And I like to say crypto is different than Bitcoin. Crypto isn't Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a crypto, but crypto isn't Bitcoin. They're very distinct, and it's important to know the difference. But we are seeing more regulation, which has been a cry in the space. Like, people have been talking about having more regulation in this space for a long time. Not because people necessarily want regulation, but regulation provides some sort of clarity and structure to an unstructured space. And unstructured spaces can be okay for a time. But after a while, and after a certain amount of growth, it can become pure chaos. And regulation can often come in and help tame that chaos and give direction. It's a double-edged sword, regulation. The last thing you really want to do is invite regulators and the government into a business that really doesn't need it, or an area that really doesn't need it. But sometimes you do need some structure. Sometimes you do need some support there. And I'm in favor of as minimal regulation as possible without destroying the ecosystem. But that's a conversation for another day. What is key here with regulation is that, as I mentioned with institutions, larger institutions need certain regulatory frameworks applied to different asset classes in order to invest, in order to have them to be an acceptable asset to put on their books. So with regulation and more regulation on the Bitcoin space, more clarity in that, it de-risks that asset more for pools of larger money. And when it's de-risked more for pools of larger money, what happens? Money will flow from those pools that are looking for places to go into something like Bitcoin. Okay, that is the bullish case for this. Now, of course, we don't want regulation to crush Bitcoin, but I am of the mindset that Bitcoin, if we want it to be a global reserve currency, if we want it to be the global base layer, right, if we want it to be the asset, the global asset, if we want to live on a Bitcoin standard, every single challenge, every single attack that is possible needs to be levied at Bitcoin, and it needs to survive. Because the last thing we want is to build something on the back of something that is just there because people liked it, and it's just got a participation trophy because you had regulators, you had individuals, you had gatekeepers that kept out all the competition. Because that only works for so long, because eventually those gates will break, the attacks will come, and if it's not able to withstand those attacks, it will fail and it'll be catastrophic. We don't want that. We don't want that. We want it to be strong. We want it to be battle hardened. We want it to face adversity so that it proves that it deserves that spot. It proves that it deserves its place on the global in the global economy. That's what I want. And so while regulation can suck, while hearing these attacks on it, what can hurt short-term price, ultimately, I believe that Bitcoin is capable of transcending that and not only surviving, but thriving in the aftermath of that, which will make it even more valuable. The regulations, while they can seem bad in the first place, in the short term, in the long term, I think they will be incredibly bullish for Bitcoin, unlocking more capital and making it more resilient to similar attacks. They might just prove that they're not even effective. And then it's just, okay, if it's not effective, we're not going to do that anymore. So we will see how that plays out, and only time will tell. But I am on the side of this is a bullish sign for Bitcoin. Number 6 is weakening fiat currencies. And why does this make Bitcoin more valuable? Well, I've talked about this before, is when you have pools of capital, when you have pools of money, right? People with lots of money, 7% inflation is basically a 7% loss in purchasing power each year. And that's like the average inflation that people have talked about, over 7 to 10% over the past decade or so, or whatever. And generally people say it's a lot higher. But if you have $100 million, that's $7 to $10 million a year you're losing. That's a lot of money. Okay. So if your large amounts of money, your pools of money that you worked hard to accumulate, right, through adding value to the world, if they're just leaking, and you know that they're leaking, okay, you're going to seek out something like Bitcoin to put that money in. And on top of this, right, the easier case to make for this is if the value of a dollar is decreasing, but the value of Bitcoin remains constant, and you value Bitcoin in dollars, it's going to take more dollars to buy that same Bitcoin. Right? So we like to talk about this on the Economic Prepper Show if you look at the Dixie. So if the Dixie goes down, you generally see that Bitcoin price might go up, right? There's correlation there because it basically costs more dollars because the dollar is less valuable. It buys less things. It costs more dollars to buy that Bitcoin. It's like trying to buy Bitcoin with the Nigerian dollar, right? It costs $1 trillion for a coffee, right? That's the same type of concept here. So you could see a numerical increase in Bitcoin, but it's a relative increase. If you had dollars and you buy Bitcoin, right, you can see a relative increase in the value of whatever those dollars would have been in Bitcoin versus what they are in dollars, because the fiat currency is continuously being inflated, being debased. You're losing purchasing power over time. So as fiat currencies continue to weaken, and we know they're all going to zero, so we know the value of your dollar is going to be less next year, the year after that, the year after that, the year after that. So if you got $100 under your mattress, okay, you're probably going to be better off over the long term if that's in Bitcoin versus in US fiat dollars. And so because of that, we will see the price of Bitcoin go up. Now, in the short term, there's all these fluctuations. Long term, the trend becomes very clear. You can go look at the charts. It's there. And which brings us to number 7, and this is technological advancements and innovation. So this has been a big hurdle for Bitcoin for the longest time. And when Bitcoin first came out, it was like, wow, this is amazing. But then people realized there's limitations to what you could do on Bitcoin with Bitcoin, how they would incorporate it, and all that kind of stuff. So we saw the emergence of a lot of these altcoins that apparently had better tech, were faster, all these other things. And they had big promises, but they failed to live up to those promises. Most of those other altcoins are still living in the shadow of Bitcoin 14 years later. And we still hear talk about these other ones that are going to take over because they have this much better technology and all this kind of stuff. I've heard in conversations about one of the reasons why that happened was Bitcoin just wasn't ready for these new layers, for these new technological innovations. So one thing is the Lightning Network that people talk about a lot. And there's obviously pros and cons to this, but that is an innovation on Bitcoin. That is a network that is built on top of the Bitcoin network that allows faster payments, scaling. It solves problems that the Bitcoin network itself can't fully solve. So it gives more usability and utility to the Bitcoin network itself with these other technological add-ons. So one thing here is these things take time, and they have to reach certain levels of critical mass in order to actually have an impact. And so with time and adding more users to these networks, to these things, we see more value starting to be accrued to Bitcoin. So this is happening. Another example of this was the creation of ordinals, okay? So ordinals are these NFTs on Bitcoin where they are based off of ordinal theory, where like the number of something produced has some sort of value or whatnot. But they allow people to create these tokens or other projects or things on the Bitcoin blockchain. And a benefit that we saw of that, or it could be a con, but was we saw more demand for Bitcoin block space. At one point in time, the fees that a miner got for writing a block to the blockchain was greater than the 6.25 Bitcoin award. That's a big thing. That's huge. That's important. Now, there's some trade-offs when that happens, but seeing demand increase to that level, right, is pretty powerful. And it was all due to technological innovations on Bitcoin. And some things just take time. You can have the infrastructure laid, but if people aren't quite ready for it or the market isn't quite ready for it, it may not utilize that infrastructure yet. It's like when you create a new wind farm or solar farm. Sometimes you just gotta build, like there's a process for this. And like you have to build it out and then you gotta connect it to the grid. So oftentimes these renewable energy systems, energy harnessing systems are built, the infrastructure's there, the ground, the lines are laid, but they're not being utilized yet until the grid is ready for them. And again, I'm no expert on that topic, but that's just a general example. Sometimes you got to build the infrastructure and the infrastructure is there and set up, and you got to wait for society and the markets to catch up for that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because you are there, you are ready when that does. And we've seen that happen on Bitcoin. And of course, as more of that is built, more time passes and more money is invested in those things and more people start using that and those networks start filling out, start growing, they start infiltrating our normal everyday economy. What happens? Right, you see a snowball effect and the speed and growth of innovation and solutions starts to increase because there's more of a reward for doing that. And of course, what does that do? More demand for the limited supply, price goes up. These are a lot of important topics and things to think about for when you're looking at Bitcoin. And these 7 reasons are why I think that Bitcoin has a very strong chance of being worth more in the future than it is now. Now, I can't give a certain time frame, but I do think that is happening and it will happen. And that it is wise to understand these 7 points and understand Bitcoin today so that you can make an educated decision that could prove very beneficial for your future. So just a quick recap of the 7 reasons that Bitcoin, I think the price is going to go up. So number 1 is a limited supply and halving events. Number 2 is increasing institutional adoption. Number 3 is growing global acceptance. Number 4 is geopolitical and economic uncertainty driving people, countries, individuals, businesses towards Bitcoin. Number 5 is institutional grade infrastructure and regulational clarity. Number 6 is weakening fiat currencies. And number 7 is technological advancements and innovations. So that's it for the 7 reasons. Please let me know what you think about these in the comments below. Let me know what you think about Bitcoin. Let me know if you like it, you don't like it, if you're team Bitcoin, if you're uncertain. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll be happy to make more videos on those in the future. That's it for today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.